What I'm called Keith. Hi Keith, welcome back. You have 15 minutes, Keith. You know the procedure obviously well, but you're free to use that time however you choose. Obviously, spread that between the committee asking questions or simply you talking to us, but feel free to use it as you like. So,
thanks very much, Prime Minister. Welcome being back amongst old friends. I think critical to understanding this bill is the context in which it sits, and that is the revelations by Edward Snowden of massive surveillance engaged in by the GCSB's main partner, that is the American National Security Agency. And it's now clear that the NSA considers the communications, the private communications of any government in the world fair game, including communications with the Russian government, Chinese, and even close allies like France and Germany. And these governments have got very upset at being spied upon in this way. You just need to look at the headlines in the paper today, for example. US spying claims may jeopardise trade deal, that is the EU-American trade deal. Unholy erupts after spying claims. And the French President, François Hollande, says, "We ask that this immediately stop. There can be no negotiations or deal making until we've obtained safeguards." So it's directly affecting those trade negotiations. And our problem here is that we are also upsetting friendly governments because the GCSB is helping the NSA gather information on them. The GCSB hands over to the NSA the information it gathers on millions of international phone calls passing through the communication satellites targeted by the satellite dishes, that's by HOPI. And it is particularly apparent from the Snowden revelations that the NSA is interested in Chinese government communications, and that it will be filtering, that is, the NSA will be filtering the international phone data gathered at Waihopa and passed on to the NSA. It will be filtered, particularly to look at Chinese communications. And what we have to face up to as a nation is that New Zealand helping the NSA spy on China, which it is doing, is not in our national interest. It is not in our national interest to spy on China, our biggest trading partner, and we're dreaming if we think there won't be a cost somewhere down the line. The Chinese Foreign Ministry responded very angrily to the Snowden revelations of extensive NSA spying on Chinese computers and mobile phone networks, and it is ironical that we are helping to spy on China supposedly in the name of national security, and the term national security is in this bill, but actually we're seriously undermining our own national security. And if there is some form of trade or investment kickback from China, which eventually there will, then the GCSB's complicity in US spying on China can be called sabotage. That's another thing that comes up in the intelligence legislation, but it will be sabotage committed by the government by spying on China, sabotage of our own economy. This is what the real world is about, and just blindness to think that somehow China won't notice this or do anything about it. And I think that before we pass such legislation as this, reinforcing the powers of the GCSB, we need to have an open and public discussion on these matters. The government just can't continue to hide behind the smoke screen that I saw in my 12 years in Parliament. Whenever something's brought up for discussion, you can't comment on that as a national security matter. For example, when I asked Helen Clark and John Key how much Waihopai costs annually to run, I can't tell you. It's a national security issue when it clearly is a genuine taxpayer issue as part of the budget that we feel pays for. Because underneath, I think the government, the Labour government, Labour-led government, and now the national government, want to avoid any serious discussion about the GCSB's main asset, that is Waihopai. And clear that Waihopai wasn't constructed in the 1980s to catch terrorists. There wasn't any war on terror then. It was to spy on governments. That is why today's news is so relevant. In the 90s it was more spying on Japanese government communications, now it's more likely to be China. And President Obama is sort of unashamed about this, really. He said a couple of days ago that to spy on the communications of other Western governments was just helping the United States understand the world better, when in fact we all know, and the European governments know, the Chinese government knows it's to get an edge for US interests in trade negotiations, helping to get the TPPA through, perhaps winning contracts for US companies in a competitive situation, etc. And that's why the EU is laying down the law against it. So we need a public discussion to determine what is actually the cost-benefit ratio of participating in this Five Eyes network led by the NSA that's spying on the rest of the world, the governments of the rest of the world. And it does generate hostility towards us. When I was on a parliamentary delegation with Bill Goff, Prime Minister to New Caledonia in 2000, we were berated by the New Caledonian government for using Waihopai to spy on them. And they were quite right. Waihopai was being used to spy on them, and they were right to be upset about it. It wasn't helping our relations with New Caledonia or other Pacific countries. Now, what do we gain? Well, we may gain a few tidbits of information from the Five Eyes network, although we don't really know. It's all behind closed doors. But I can't imagine that there is any great gain for us. And we're a very open society ourselves. There's nothing much to hide. There is some evidence that the GCSB activity is not really opening up any serious inquiry on criminality. The Rebecca Kitteridge report mentions 55 warranted SIS operations over a 10-year period that the GCSB assisted on. One of the things motivating the spill. But Ian Fletcher, the GCSB director, said that not one single case did legal proceedings follow. Whereas if you look at the police stats for the last year, the last figures I could come up with was 25 warrants, 45 arrests under the Crimes Act, and similar figures under the Drugs Act. So it doesn't appear that the SIS backed up what the GCSB is spying on real criminality, because decades really they haven't come up with a case where they've successfully launched a prosecution. Even the one case they launched against Bill Sutch turned out to be a failure. So all these things need to be discussed, and the relative impact of the intrusion on our privacy, any gain in terms of detecting crime. All this needs to be discussed very openly. And I don't want to take up all my time. You've given me 15 minutes, so I'll leave it there for questions.
So can I just ask you one question? I wouldn't want to imply that does or doesn't GCSB gather information on China, but do you believe the Chinese gather any information about New Zealand?
I think if the Chinese are gathering information on New Zealand, it would primarily to get hold of what the Five Eyes is, because they know the Five Eyes is spying on them. New Zealand is a smaller, possibly less sophisticated place, so the Chinese might be trying to hook into the GCSB to get some of the Five Eyes information. But if we weren't part of the Five Eyes, that wouldn't be the case. Now, I think it's common...
So in terms of communications between individual New Zealanders, not the ones in between the various agencies that are of no real concern, they would have no real interest in doing that, is that right?
Yeah, I think we're in a bit of a different situation from some other countries too, because we're a very open society with e-government, and you just need to go to the Beehive website to find out everything that you say, and the Parliament website to find out everything the other MPs say. You've got Hansard, you've got direct broadcast. Our economy's pretty open. If anyone wants to know about our defence force, you can find out in 5 minutes by going to the defence website. What are the secrets that the Chinese would be interested in?
So on that basis, then, do you not agree with the Green Party and the Labour Party who believe that Huawei are spying on individual New Zealanders, that New Zealand should not be allowed to operate in New Zealand? Because as you said,
is spying on New Zealand. And,
agree that
it's
a spurious argument.
I think that it's unlikely, to be honest, because when you've got a multi-billion-dollar international company, they're trying to protect their brand. So I don't think they would be want to get caught spying unnecessarily on the communication of people in other countries.
Yeah, just first question. I mean, just following on from that, do you think that some of our companies, our strategic companies in New Zealand, might be spied upon for intellectual property? Some of our high-tech companies, you don't think that might be valuable for overseas countries to try and obtain?
It's possible, although the high-tech companies would probably be the ones best able to protect themselves from hacking or detective hacking of space. But, a lot of the stuff, even the Fonterra stuff, they auction milk now, it's out in the open much more. Sorry,
And I just following on from that, so in a sense you don't believe that there's a real need to provide, or say that our intelligence agencies to keep an eye on the type of gathering, spying on some of our companies that might result in our IP being stolen, economic sectors being taken, anything like. You don't think that's a risk?
Well, it's good to have a cyber security capacity. That capacity could be run by the police. The police are already involved in cyber security. One of the big unknowns in this debate is what extra technology the GCSB brings to the party in cyber security protection. What I'm saying more is that being in the Five Eyes is actually more the downside than an upside. Like the future bits of information maybe marginally help in cyber security, but the downside in terms of annoying all the countries in the world other than the other four in the Five Eyes is a much greater danger, and particularly when we're a trading company that trades in very different markets, and most of those markets are not too enamoured with the Five Eyes spying on the rest of the world.
Did you ever see information that was provided by the Five Eyes? Did you ever see any documents that were provided by them?
I didn't see Five Eyes documents because they. No, hold on. There's one document I did see. And that is a memorandum. It was a whistleblower called Catherine Gunn, disclosed in early 2003, and she was working with GCHQ, a partner agency to GCSB. And it was a memorandum from Frank Koza, who was an official of the NSA, calling for a surge of interceptions of the communications of dissident members of the Security Council in the period leading up to the Iraq War. And the countries like Chile and Mexico and Pakistan were sort of not knowing whether to go with the US line of supporting the war or against. And this was passed before the Five Eyes. So what that memorandum meant, was that New Zealand, even though under Helen Clark we were trying to keep out of the war, through Five Eyes, the GCSB was spying on the communications of friendly nations like Chile and Mexico to help get America into the war with UN backing. So one of the problems with the Five Eyes is that our foreign policy is not identical with that of other countries in it, particularly America, over questions like Iraq and other questions. So the Five Eyes network is a very integrated network with complete sharing of raw data. The Five Eyes network is used primarily for American foreign policy interests, which are not the same as our own. So that undermines New Zealand having an independent foreign policy.
It isn't the truth of the point, though, that in your entire time being a Member of Parliament, you actually never saw documents that were actually supplied by the Five Eyes. So you actually can't say whether the provided information was useful to our defence forces and our military people serving overseas or potential threats that were here in New Zealand. That's your view that you formed that it doesn't do that, but you can't actually corroborate that anyway.
Yeah, I think that's one of the issues too, that there should be much more openness about particularly the results, the successes of the GCSB and its relationship to the Five Eyes and its current situation. I see in Britain they're now going to a situation where the intelligence security there is going to be able to interrogate the heads of the intelligence agencies. We should have a situation
Minister mentioned, you noted that it probably wasn't a problem or a threat or any sort of issue. Yet, United States, Canada, the UK, the UK has used it, spent $26 billion trying to reverse it, and Australia have all cut Huawei out of their intelligence services. Do you think there's a pattern there, and do you think that perhaps we were wise to go ahead and allow them to come in here, and now are starting to think about some restrictions?
Well, I suspect that Britain and America, for their own geopolitical reasons, don't want Taiwan. They aren't too keen on big Chinese multinationals sort of pushing aside from America. I think that's more what's operating there. It's more of a trade protection sort of question.
So, just on the question as to the original GCSB legislation passed in 2003, you were present at the time. Since then, there's become some debate as to whether that legislation specifically prevented the GCSBs from spying on New Zealand. And I know that you were one of those present during that debate, and I just asked your impressions. And just to jog your memory, I just got a very short quote here during the debate where a government, a National Party member said that there are some interesting submissioners, people who are quite bent on conspiracy theories and seem to think that all the GCSB ever does is listening in on New Zealanders' telephone calls, which is, of course, expressly prohibited. This is a government member. The Bureau is not allowed to listen in on New Zealanders. Now, the author of that statement was Tony Ryle in the debate in the House, where he was very, very clear in the original legislation that the GCSB was not allowed to listen in on New Zealanders' communications. Now, was that your recollection of the debate at the time as well?
Yeah, that was a very good speech, I think. And certainly the speeches I made, the speeches Labour MPs made, Labour was government at the time, they all repeated over and over that foreigners wouldn't be, New Zealanders wouldn't be spied upon as a result of foreign intelligence. And the same debate took place in
Were you surprised later when members who were involved in that debate said, there's some ambiguity as to whether the GCSB
there's two things. A, there wasn't ambiguity as far as I could see. And the other thing is when courts, this is why it's never gone to a court, instead comes to legislation. When courts rule, they go back to the debates in Parliament and interpret the legislation in terms of what the intention of the government and the Parliament was. And any judge looking at those debates, and all the debates since in the years since 2003, would come to the conclusion that New Zealanders were not spied on. Absolutely. And one of the points I did raise at the time in those debates was that the problem with phone calls, particularly the international phone calls intercepted by HOPI, without any warrants involved, is most phone calls, international phone calls and other calls, don't come with passports attached. So it's very hard when an agency is intercepting them to work out whether New Zealanders are overseas people. Plus, as part of the debate in the United States currently, the NSA says, no, we're not spying on Americans, but Americans communicate with foreigners, and so their calls are being intercepted in that way.
Okay, Tech Liberty is next. They can come to name. Thomas Beagles and Richard Wallace. You're Thomas? Okay, Thomas, so you have 15 minutes as you're aware, and you're free to use that time however you choose, so please go ahead. Thank you.
I represent Tech Liberty. We're appreciative of the meeting for liberty in this age. We see many problems in the field, and thinking in life, problems that we describe in our submission. So I want to concentrate just a few of those that are particularly central to our group's reasons for existing. Firstly, as a civil liberties group, we're concerned this bill significantly expands the powers of the GCSB. There's been a lot of spin one way or another on this issue, but we see that the GCSB's new purpose of protecting New Zealand's cybersecurity being used as an excuse to give them broad oversight and control of the country's telecommunications networks. We see the new permissions to use their equipment and people to assist the SAS, the police, and oddly the Defence Force. This is the ability to spy on New Zealanders for a number of reasons, including both those purposes just mentioned. And we also see incredibly wide-ranging warrants and access authorisations that can be granted to classes of people and systems with little meaningful oversight. We believe that these powers combine what is left unsaid in the bill to prove a real threat to the security and well-being of Kiwis. In particular, we fear this bill will allow significant mass surveillance. It's commonly said that information is power, and government surveillance leads to an accumulation of information that changes the power balance in our society. Knowing that everything is being watched tends to make dissent more timid, limiting our freedom of expression and the effective working of our democracy. People still believe in privacy, and at times will do things that are lawful and reasonable, but they may not want their friends, peers or workmates to know about. It's not illegal to have an affair or be in the closet, but this information can be used to wreck lives or compel obedience. Can we trust a government agency to collect this sort of information and not abuse it? And this is not because we believe that the people who work for and oversee the GCSB are bad people. It's because we believe that they, like the rest of us, are also human. Now, what sort of threat must our country be facing to warrant these measures? The Cold War is over. The last terrorist attack in New Zealand was nearly 30 years ago. We have no significant enemies. The internet provides some interesting challenges in terms of scammers and hackers, but even there, the impact is small scale. The arguments made for this bill tend to be either non-existent or censored, hiding behind the idea that we can't be trusted to know the threats that face our country, an assertion we find to be self-serving and weak. Bringing this back to civil liberties and the New Zealand Bill of Rights, can the powers being granted by this bill and the consequent impact on our rights and freedoms be demonstrably justified as necessary in a free democratic society? We believe that concentrating this sort of power in the hands of a government agency is a far greater threat to our personal security than paranoid dreams of overseas terrorists and Nigerian internet scammers. I now want to talk about two of the issues that are fundamentally important to tech liberty. The first is metadata, the second, connected but not the same, is mass surveillance. The availability of cheap information storage, fast networks, and powerful data processing tools has materially changed how surveillance is done in the modern era. There is now so much data that can be captured and analysed that what was once harmless is now, when done on a massive scale, a threat to our liberty. We've been hearing a lot about metadata recently in the revelations about PRISM in the USA and the spying done by the GCHQ in the United Kingdom. As you probably all know by now, metadata is information that describes other data. And a phone call is the conversation is regarded as the data, or the numbers called, when it was, how long they talked for, where they were when they talked about it, etc. is regarded as the metadata. Some people take the view that metadata isn't important or doesn't deserve protection. We saw in the Kitteridge report that the GCSB viewed metadata as something they can access, free of the constraints that applies on the internet communications. But this view is wrong. We recently saw the power of metadata in New Zealand Parliament when the number, frequency and timing of emails were used to make assumptions about behaviour that led to a resignation, even though the content of those emails wasn't revealed. Metadata can be used to work out who you associate with, make assumptions about your health, your hobbies, your politics, where you go and what you do when you're there. It can be used to find out all sorts of things about you, possibly even reveal things you don't know about yourself. Metadata is in some ways more useful to spy agencies than the communications themselves. Metadata is consistent, neatly formatted, and far easier for a computer to analyse than messy, hard-to-interpret human conversations. Metadata is an important part of modern surveillance and spying, and there is no doubt that the GCSB has been involved in its collection and analysis. But this bill doesn't mention it. It doesn't clarify the rules around when and who the GCSB can collect metadata about. There's no mention of where they can and can't get it from, or how long they can keep it, or anything else. There's no indication that Kitteridge's recommendation that metadata be treated the same as communications has been accepted. The second thing enabled by our new and cheaper technology is mass surveillance, the ability to collect communications and metadata about everyone. Why bother targeting when you can collect everything easily, store it cheaply, and then mine that stored data with interesting correlations? The justification is that by collecting all this data, you can do a better job of spotting the bad guys because they behave differently. I'm not sure that this holds up in New Zealand, where we basically don't have any terrorists for our systems to detect patterns from. Are we going to single out the French for special attention? We see mass surveillance as a betrayal of the idea that in our society you should be free from government spying unless there is a demonstrably good reason that you should be subject to it, and that this spying has been subject to sufficient oversight. And once again, mass surveillance built on a database of information about innocent people that is open to misuse and abuse. Unfortunately, the bill says very little about mass data collection, especially if it's only metadata. There are very few or no limits on what can be collected, how it can be used, and who the derived information can be shared with. One answer might be that the bill says it doesn't says very little because it doesn't authorise it, and therefore the GCSB can't do it. but we don't think that stands up to scrutiny. When we look at the bill, we can't help but notice the potential for incredibly broad warrants and access authorisations in Section 15A. In 15A1A, we see warrants that can be granted for communications made or received by classes of persons, with very little limitation on how these classes of persons can be defined. Even more worrying is the access authorisation in 1B, that allows the Bureau to access one or more specified information infrastructures. And because it's a bit jargony, I'm going to read out the definition of information infrastructures. It includes electromagnetic emissions, communication systems and networks, information technology systems and networks, and any communication carried on, contained in, or relating to those emission systems or networks. In other words, it includes every form of electronic communication and the associated metadata. A single access authorisation could be granted to give access deep into our telecommunications networks to enable the GCSB to collect whatever data they see fit. This access authorisation could be open-ended, without limit, and as 15A5 makes clear, not be limited by any other law. You may look at this GCSB bill and see some mild tweaking of the current law. We look at it and see there's a moment that New Zealand changes from being a society that investigates bad guys, subject to judicial oversight, to being a surveillance state where the government is always watching and recording everyone, just in case they're thinking about doing anything wrong. We believe there are simple solutions to some of these problems, and they should be incorporated into this bill. The first is that metadata must be treated the same as communications and should have the same limitations. Secondly, that the GCSB should be explicitly forbidden from creating any databases of information about New Zealanders who are not actively under investigation. And thirdly, that the warrants and access authorisations must be much more tightly defined and controlled to ensure they are appropriately targeted. Now, there's a chance you're sitting there thinking we've got all this wrong. The bill doesn't provide for these things that we fear. If this is the case, the bill must be very badly drafted, because a large number of people and groups who have looked at it have come to very similar conclusions. In this case, the bill needs to be rewritten to make these limits clear. However, if it is the intention of this committee and the government to allow the GCSB to engage in these activities, which we certainly hope it isn't, they should be properly codified and defined in the law with appropriate limits and controls, rather than being left to be read between the lines. Finally, we wish to make a brief submission on oversight. Civil liberties recognises that our freedoms and rights may need to be intruded on in certain circumstances. At the same time, we believe that these intrusions must be done as openly as possible with suitable oversight. We also believe we have a right to know what form these intrusions take. The GCSB has highly intrusive powers that exercise in secret. This secrecy means these powers are open to abuse in a way that doesn't apply to most other government agencies. Currently, operational oversight consists of the Minister, typically the Prime Minister, who is typically generally very, very busy, and the Director of the Inspector General of Intelligence. The new regime suggested in this bill is that operational oversight will consist of the Prime Minister and the Inspector General of Intelligence. In other words, except for slight tweaking around their powers and appointment of the Inspector General, nothing has changed. We do not find this reiteration of a failed model to be an acceptable level of openness and oversight. We need an expanded and significantly better system of operational oversight that doesn't rely on one politician and their direct appointees. Ideally, one with some involvement of the judiciary and possibly civil society. This bill does not provide it. In conclusion, while we've made some suggestions as to how this bill can improve, we think this does not go far enough. We see the powers being given to the GCSB as being more of a threat to the security of New Zealanders than the perceived problems these powers are meant to fix. Some may argue that we are being naive and that we would change our minds if we could see what horrors our intelligence service protect us from. We would argue that in New Zealand we're lucky that we don't have to be scared all the time. And we don't want to be railroaded by politicians naive enough to believe the self-serving scare stories told them by the bureaucrats and intelligence agencies. We ask the committee to reject this bill. We believe that New Zealand needs a full inquiry into what we want our intelligence agencies to do and the power we
Said you started your submission and ended pretty much the same place, which was that essentially there are no significant risks here in New Zealand or to New Zealanders, therefore there's no activities that are warranted by the GCSB. Can you tell me what document you were researching that from, or is that just an assumption?
I counsel the terrorist strikes in New Zealand over the last 30 years. I came up with one. That's actually pretty startling.
Do you think there's a possibility that risks to New Zealanders are averted through the actions of understanding those that might undertake a terrorist plot, or do you think that's just not happening in New Zealand?
I suspect it's very unlikely, and if it was actually happening, I would expect the GCSB to be telling us about it.
Right, so in the event that you were wrong and there was terrorist activity or there was action which led to the death of New Zealanders, what hypothetically there was a bomb at the airport and some people died, you don't think you should
And
be
your
responsible for the
hypothesis
government?
is that the GCSB wouldn't be able to stop that or has stopped that in the past?
No, I'm just simply asking the question, if you don't think they play a role and you don't think there should be a response, is that's the response of the Prime Minister today, is to say, I don't bother responding because I didn't collect the information because I didn't perceive there was a threat. That's the right line.
I don't think it's that. You're simply explaining the idea that if anything bad happens, the council might stop.
I'm not talking about whether you could or would always stop them. I'm talking about in the event that you don't bother collecting
In the
information.
event, you could possibly apologise for not putting cameras in everyone's homes, saying if we had cameras in everyone's homes, we would have spotted those terrorists blocking. That's a meaningless question.
At all, and as we have a GCSB, you're suggesting in your evidence that they're self-serving bureaucrats who tell the politicians what they want to know to keep them in business.
I believe that all bureaucrats have certain self-serving elements, but it's partly how they work. The thing is that we don't really know that the GCSB has been spying on foreigners.
That's not really the question though, is it?
So really fun question on that, I made a question.
There shouldn't be a GCSB. There's no need to be eavesdropping on anyone. And anyway, the people of the GCSB are self-serving bureaucrats that are telling the politicians what they want to hear to keep them in business.
I believe that the surveillance approach should be targeted and done under judicial oversight, judicial or other meaningful oversight, not being broad brushstrokes, getting information.
That's not actually what you said though, was it?
Sorry?
It wasn't actually what you said though, was it?
I believe it was.
As I understand it, what you're saying is we're talking about facilitating mass surveillance. Your view is that the bill facilitates mass surveillance via the GCSB. Now, just on the metadata, now that's interesting because we've been told not to worry about metadata, but your argument is that metadata actually is very powerful. For example, you give some examples here. You might also talk about journalists who are investigating something. If the GCSB was able to track what they were doing, they could figure out what they were investigating and so forth. And of course, we've had the most recent example with Mr. Peter Dunn and the use of his metadata off the parliamentary email system. So your argument is that the metadata matters and we need to treat it the same as any other kind of communication.
Absolutely. We recognise there is a purpose for spy agencies, same as the police have a purpose in doing surveillance and inspections and so on. We think it should be done under oversight. So rather than being this sort of broad brushstrokes allowed for, a broad collection of data allowed for in this bill.
So like the advisory committee, you would be much more supportive if there was proper independent judicial oversight of warranted process rather than the GCSB being able to in an unwarranted way to go and find them.
Absolutely.
Could I just clarify something? In the bill here under 8B, it says to gather information about information infrastructures. Can you just elaborate about information infrastructures? I mean, is that synonymous with metadata?
Information infrastructures is much wider than that. I actually read the definition for it, and it basically information infrastructures include every telecommunication, every system in the country. It includes every computer system in the country. It includes every mobile wireless communication system in the country, and it includes the communications that are held on those.
In your opinion, is this the way that this information is collected and stored? Is it at risk of being shared outside of New Zealand as a result of this legislation?
I struggle reading the legislation because there are some limits in there, but there are also many exceptions, and I couldn't give you a definitive answer on that because I get lost in it. Thank you.
Vikram Kumar. So Mr. Kumar, you have 10 minutes. You're free to obviously speak for all of that time. You're free to have the committee ask you questions or to split that. Obviously, time's in your hands.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to present in my personal capacity. Given the limitations of time that you've mentioned, I think I'll start by saying that I endorse everything that Thomas Leibowitz has said, and rather than repeat what he said, I'll just take it slightly further. I also want to start by saying that I've had the opportunity in my previous jobs to work with the GCSB, and hard work and within the constraints that they operate. At the end of the day, that's the problem that hasn't been spoken about yet, which is their constraints that they currently operate in, which includes access to skilled resources. There's a limit in New Zealand. There's limitations in terms of the internal culture and structure of the organization, which hopefully is also being addressed. But given all of these limitations, I'd say that expanding the role of GCSB, particularly to economic well-being, is troubling. It's troubling because that term, economic well-being, could cover pretty much anything that anybody wants it to cover. The other troubling part is that the GCSB does an extremely good job in trying to secure and work with government departments and is now expanding its work with the private sector in terms of protecting from cybersecurity threats. Unfortunately, the expansion of scope of the GCSB, even in that arena, means that they will now be allowed to spy without a warrant on all the information infrastructure in New Zealand. And therefore they take the position that we are spying when it's not required or appropriate in that particular instance for our own good. The other issue which I feel here is that there has been no analysis done in terms of dollars. There's been a statement that the reason why GCSB will be allowed to spy on New Zealanders is because they have access to certain technologies and the cost of providing that to other departments, it will be too high. There is no figure that I can see anywhere that provides that number. So, on the other hand, we know that the GCSB will have to get beefed up to be able to cope with the increase in resource, increase in scope that they've got. But there's no numbers there. And it may well be that the extra amount that the GCSB is going to be required is substantially lower than what would be required to beef up SIS and the other departments.
If you think that the GCSB, if you accept that the GCSB has historically been providing these services under agency to the other departments like SIS or defence, and the purpose of the law is fundamentally to clarify that position because there's clearly conflict potentially existing around Section 14 and Section 8, what changes when the law changes if it's just doing now under the new law what it was doing in the past?
I reject completely the assertion that the law is only being legitimizing what it was doing illegally. There is a substantial expansion in scope of the GCSB bill. Either the GCSB will not do that, or they will cherry pick, in which case the decision will probably be political.
What bit of the bill do you point to that shows that?
Sorry?
What bit of the bill do you point to that shows that?
There's the inclusion of economic well-being, which has been there before. There is the expansion of of what it does in terms of information infrastructure. And thirdly, there is an example where the agencies which GCSB can help can simply be increased by a cabinet decision as opposed to parliamentary oversight. So cabinet can decide just at a meeting that Inland Revenue or MSD are one of those departments which the GCSB can now help under the law without any parliamentary discussion. I think the biggest issue also is that Section 15A, 1A, 1B says, and I quote here because it's astonishing, it says that the GCSB can apply for the interception warrant to the minister, authorizing the use of interception devices to intercept communications not otherwise lawfully obtainable. So we're going through the whole process of creating a bill and then insert a section which says the GCSB can get a warrant to do whatever it wants, which was not otherwise lawfully obtainable to it. I don't see why we would have a bill if we could just have that one clause in it. And so as a summary, as the time is up, and I'll answer one or two questions if they are, I believe that this bill will move any New Zealand company that wants to be a global internet supplier of online services from being in the position of being one of the best countries in the world today to do that, to be one of the worst countries in the world. Any questions?
Sure. I'm interested in this last point. Can you kind of take us through what will be the impact on the ICT sector, and particularly
that the privacy laws of New Zealand have been recognized to be adequate by the European Union. This has given New Zealand ICT companies and global players operating out of New Zealand a huge competitive advantage. If we change the law the way and the companion telco intersection bill, the image of New Zealand as a place where privacy is protected and is subject to judicial oversight will be completely removed, and we will be operating in an environment of suspicion, just as we see, and in fact I would say much worse than what is happening to the US ICT companies today.
It's connected to your argument around the connection, the international connection, right? So not only would then the data that's held by internet-based companies in New Zealand be vulnerable to being accessed by the state, but then that data could be shared with the other Five Eyes partners or shared internationally, and that undermines those companies.
All data today being collected by GCSB is shared with the NSA and the Five Eyes. There's just one system. And I would certainly think that if the committee and Parliament wants to extend GCSB to spy on New Zealanders legally, there must be watertight provisions made that any data collected in that situation, which is the third part of GCSB, does not send overseas, particularly the NSA.
You'd acted with GCSB in your previous capacity, right?
Sorry?
You said earlier you'd worked with GCSB in your previous capacity.
Yes.
And so they had been acting with you to do what? Can you tell us what you were actually doing with them?
Well, I was working in various organizations where they were assisting or discussing within the constraints that they were allowed to. And none of the discussions here that I've
Commercial entities,
Sorry?
Were they commercial entities, companies?
No.
They're private individuals. What were they?
I was working for government, and I was working for not-for-profit for the New Zealand government as a bureaucrat. But I'm here.
Self-perpetuating.
I certainly hear what Thomas was saying, because I think it's about mindset, and the GCSB mindset is essentially a spying mindset, because that's what they are. They are supposed to be signal intelligence, and now we are making them into effectively what a police mindset is, which is trying to stop crime. And that's where I get back to economic well-being. It's substantially broader than national security or law enforcement.
From a point of view of Europe, and I mean working in different other departments, it says that here that they would assist those other GCSB would assist other departments. What do you mean by that in terms of providing assistance?
GCSB has done a very good job of providing things like information on protecting government systems. I think it's an open secret that the government systems have been very poor in terms of security, and we've seen that recently coming through. And that's a role that they must play, and that is why they must have the resources and the priorities so that they can do that kind of work, not only with government departments, but also with the private sector.
Can I just come back?
Sorry,
Just come back on the point that was being made about us having an added value or a competitive advantage with your work there. How would you compare this legislation with, say, for example, the Patriot Act that's being put into the United States, that's being contested at the moment?
The GCSB bill as it is currently drafted goes substantially beyond anything that there is in the United States. There is no judicial oversight, there is no parliamentary oversight, there are completely open clauses like a class of person. A class of person could be anyone who sent an email to the United States in the last 1 year, or it could be much narrower. And so the provisions in this bill are substantially wider than what I see available in most other countries, but including the Patriot Act.
The GCSB legislation as it exists now is adequate for what the GCSB does in terms of the knowledge you have working with the GCSB, and there's really no need for this new legislation.
There is a need for new legislation, but not this one. The new legislation required is better oversight, better control, and completely removal of their ability to spy on New Zealand residents and citizens.
Like the oversight provisions where the Office of Inspector General is beefed up, where there's a deputy inspector, where there is greater transparency. Do you like those aspects or no?
Marginal. I think that there's substantial. The big opportunity is this particular committee to be able to provide a much bigger role, including independent investigations where required. parliamentary oversight at a cross-political level, rather than everything is run only by the minister in charge and his appointees or her appointees.
Can I just follow up on obviously I'm halfway through the question. Sure. What would you like to see in terms of this committee here? Because there's obviously, when you look overseas, the more substantive, independent oversight from a democratic point of view, a parliamentary point of view. What would you like to see instead?
Two things. First of all, the big leave that we have of operations and therefore not providing information, that needs to be completely removed and remain only at purely operational level. So, for example, this committee should be aware and should be asking how much of information does the GCSB send overseas about New Zealand citizens and how much does it receive. That isn't a particularly operational matter, and I think that the definition of operational has to be toned right down to actual activities on the ground. Secondly, this committee should be able to launch independent investigations and have the ability to call and ask questions if and when required.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Michael has asked. Who's asked? Have I got your name correct, Michael?
Yeah.
Fair enough. Okay. Thanks very much. So, I'm pretty sure you're aware of the drill. You've got 10 minutes. Good luck. Thanks.
By way of introduction now, this is my first time presenting in front of anything even remotely like this, so I apologise in advance if I make some horrible procedural faux pas. My name is Michael Kozianski. I'm a director, shareholder, consultant to several technology companies in New Zealand and overseas. However, I'm speaking here independently as myself, not as a representative in any of those companies. In terms of my background, I am a software engineering and software development process specialist. In addition to that, my main claim to fame, for want of a better word, is that I'm the security coordinator for a large open source web development project called Ruby on Rails. We have hundreds of thousands of users all around the world, and it's my job to coordinate vulnerabilities, hacks, all of the kind of things that GCSB normally deals with in terms of their analysis. That stuff for our project flows through me, and as a result of that, I tend to deal on a regular basis with people who are active in that industry. I'd also like to say that any matters in the bill which I don't comment on, I don't want that to be read into either tacit support or tacit opposition to there are aspects of this bill which I have no problem with, and there are aspects of this bill or the lack of things contained in this bill which trouble me a great deal. If I'm silent on something, don't assume that it's because I either support or oppose it. One thing that has concerned me about the media coverage and the discussion to date is that the individuals who work for GCSB, as Vikram spoke earlier, they are all individuals, they are dedicated public servants. In my experience, having known people who have worked for the Bureau in the past, they are typically working in relatively constrained environments. They are paid significantly less than they would make working for the public sector, and I think it's regrettable if any of this discussion or any of these debates around the law are construed or can be spun in such a way as to imply that these people are either not doing their job or they're just plants for the NSA or something like that. I think it's been quite regrettable, and that's definitely not a view that I hold myself. GCSB has a very important role. I make the vast majority of our income from remote consulting work that we do over the internet for United States and European-based companies. I have a direct and personal interest in seeing that our internet communications remain secure, looked after, and we need an agency that is well-versed and looks after that kind of thing. Additionally, it's very important from my perspective at least that the New Zealand public has the faith that that agency is acting in our own best interests. Whether you believe that the current sort of negative clouding over the GCSB is as a result of sort of hyperbole or outrageous accusations or legitimate concerns about the growing surveillance state, I don't think that's particularly relevant. The most concerning thing about it from my perspective is that there is a lack of public trust in the role of the GCSB, and that we must do things in order to rebuild that trust, and that may mean that we need to disclose additional information that otherwise, in a normal situation, should everyone remain happy with the GCSB's operation, we would not choose to disclose. So the purpose of this bill is apparently to address the issues of so-called illegal spying by the Bureau on New Zealand citizens that were covered in both the Kitteridge report and the Inspector General's report. Now, unfortunately, I don't have access to the Inspector General's report. My understanding is that was private. The only information I have is the GCSB Director's summary of that, so I'm going to base all of my statements off that. If they're incorrect, I do apologise. the cases of domestic surveillance which the IG covered broke down into 4 aspects. Either no information was intercepted at all, unclear to me how they were investigated in the first place, but obviously there were concerns. GCSB technical assistance, there was no information in the Kitteridge report that, at least on my reading, could enable me to make a meaningful comment on whether or not I would agree or disagree with GCSB providing quote-unquote technical assistance to other agencies. I had no idea what that assistance was, what's involved, or what oversight of anything was there. Another category was individuals who were subject to security service warrants. Now, I realise that this would make me an outlier in my industry, however, I have no issues with the GCSB being able to perform duly warranted intercepts for the New Zealand Security and Intelligence Service, the New Zealand Police. I'll confess to being quite confused about what the Defence Force would require this interception capability for, but I'm willing to just assume that there is some legitimate need for that, and if not, then perhaps that information can be struck out. Section 8C of the bill, specifically Section 8C2, makes it abundantly clear to both the client agencies and GCSB itself and all its employees that when the GCSB is performing those interceptions for a client agency, it is bound by the regulations and laws that bind the client agency. I think that that is an excellent improvement. It means there is absolutely no ambiguity where the GCSB employees can mistakenly or by default fall back on their greater powers that they have under their other abilities granted in Section 8. However, the topic that I wanted to cover off most importantly is the issue of metadata collection. Now, several other people have commented on this in particular. What I would like to highlight to the committee's perspective and to the public in general is that, to the best of my knowledge, there's no definition of metadata provided either in the Act or in case law that I can get my hands on. It's merely taken as sort of the absence of something. If it is not a communication, then it is taken to be metadata. The nearest I can find to a definition from the GCSB is that, as a statement from the media statement on 21st of May of this year, an example of metadata is the information on a telephone bill, such as the time, duration of a phone call, but not the content, or the identification of people using that phone call. Unfortunately, to provide a single example of what may be considered metadata is completely inadequate, and there are legitimate concerns that need to be raised. In addition to the information which may appear on a phone bill, communications metadata can include the duration of those phone calls that you make, the location that you were at when they were made, the location of the person who you were speaking with. With modern smartphones, your data connection is almost always active, which means that the metadata is not considered part of the communications, which would contain your location. When any data packet was configured, would effectively give the ability to GCSB or any other agency to hoover up your location 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now, if you put your phone in airplane mode, arguably they can't do that, but there's no restriction in the Act in its current form outlining what metadata is and how it should be restricted. My main concern with this is not necessarily the points which Thomas and Vikram raised earlier about we have a right to privacy with regard to this metadata. That is certainly true. My main concern is the significant risk of false positives from this ever-increasing number of dimensions for this analysis. We pile on additional things. There are additional correlations for every different piece of information we're tracking for people in this room. We're only looking at first dates, maybe 1 or 2 of us will share. If we're looking at mode of transport to work, suddenly there are 3 people who have something in common, and that list can build up. But the list will lead to people's names being on lists which are looked after by an agency with a genuine need to hold that information secretly. However, we'll have no information, no knowledge that our information is being held, that I'm considered a threat or a risk on this list. Now, obviously, with my position that you can assume good intent from the people who work at GCSB and SIS, these people would review that name and remove me from that list because, hey, it just so happened that my running route takes me past GCSB, the Chinese embassy and the Iranian embassy yesterday. However, if you look at the press coverage for the aftermath of the Boston bombing, when it was revealed that the Tsarnaev brothers were on the FBI watch list and were removed, what possible security specialist is now going to be willing to remove someone's name from these lists out of the risk that in the future questions will be asked in the House about we knew these people were risks and why is it that we haven't done anything about it? So I would like to propose a few solutions to this issue. First of all, I'd suggest at the very least a definition of metadata or a limit or an enumeration of the information which is considered metadata to be included as part of this Act. I think that there should be some either warrant or access authorization or some system on the basis of individualized suspicion or a reasonable basis before this information can be collected. The GCSB should not be able to hoover that up on everyone. Additionally, I'd like to suggest an improvement to the disclosures which are currently provided by GCSB and NZFI NZSIS, if you look at the statement on warrants from NZSIS, we're informed that during the year under review, 23 domestic interception warrants were enforced. Of those, 16 were issued during the year under review and 7 were issued during the previous year. That gives me a broad picture of the volume of surveillance which is happening. Now, of course, there are issues about a single warrant may concern one or multiple people. I think that the disclosure should contain an estimated number of people who are affected by these. However, when you compare this with GCSB statements on warrants, the statement on interception warrants is some GCSB interception warrants are in place over this time frame. Of course, some GCSB interception warrants are in place over this time frame. Were they not, we could sublease the space on 50th Street and make more effective use of our funds. The last point I'd like to make is something which was not covered in my written submission. In particular, I have concern about road flight, not for the reasons which have been covered by other people, though I'll leave that to them to outline, but that being able to distinguish between whether or not something is communication and something is metadata is a complicated legal and technical matter. It's very difficult for me to have confidence that respected members of this committee and the Honourable Justice McGeegan, who's just been appointed, has the necessary technical capabilities. I know that the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet has the ability to appoint a technical advisor to this committee. I have no idea if that is done. Similarly, I have no idea if there is a technical advisor appointed to the Inspector General. I would like to suggest that a role be created for one or both of those things, especially so that there is technical advice for the Inspector General at the coal face at the interception, so that they can drill into any particular data capture which happened and help the Inspector General understand the necessary legal action. If I have any more time, I'm happy to take questions.
Your point on metadata and relate to the Act which talks of the bill, which talks about information infrastructure, and ask you to comment on what you take that to be and how wide that could stretch in terms of its definition. Non-definition, but I mean...
Exactly, it's a non-definition. So if we take it as meaning everything which is not a communication, then obviously you can stretch that definition to be as specific as you like. In the case of emails, for instance, it would depend on the manner in which you received the necessary metadata intercepts. The from and to addresses and the subjects of emails are all stored in the same place. They go out over the same network connection. So if that information is being gathered by a network intercept, then there's an enormous risk that in addition to intercepting the metadata of those communications, you're also intercepting the communications itself. An inherent nature of that.
And intercepting that, you could obviously, once you have that metadata, you can plumb down into the actual data itself, is that right?
Potentially. Again, it would depend on the specific nature of the interceptions, of which I have absolutely no knowledge. But as I say, from my perspective, it would be important that the Inspector General or this committee or both have necessary technical advisors to answer those kinds of questions, because I'm not in a position to answer that.
And just I guess in summary, I mean, even that part alone, in combination with others, you would see this bill as a substantive increase or an expansion of the powers of the GCSB given.
I think that would be an inaccurate characterisation of my statements. My belief is that the GCSB now takes its position as having permission to gather metadata for whatever reasons, through whatever means it is that it does that, and this bill does nothing to change that. So I don't believe that this bill is an expansion with respect to the GCSB's metadata powers, but I certainly don't believe that it applies anything like a reasonable restriction on this matter. Okay, thanks.
So we are moving to Internet New Zealand, and that is Susan Chalmers and Jordan Carter. You speak to it, Jordan, or Susan, or both? We'll both do that. Okay, so you guys have been around, but you know the drill, obviously. So you have 20 minutes, and feel free to leave some time if you want questions. So.
Thank you, Prime Minister and members of the committee, for the chance to speak with you today about this bill. My name is Jordan Carter. I'm the Chief Executive of Internet NZ. My colleague Susan Chalmers is our policy lead. And our dual mission as an organisation is to administer the .nz domain name space and to defend the open and uncatchable Internet for New Zealand. And our focus here is on applying technical and public policy skills and understanding of the Internet to this legislation. In our opening remarks today, we want to hit 3 points. Some aspects of the economic impact this legislation may have, because this is not just a security issue, this is an economic one as well. Some comments that Susan will make regarding metadata, and a reiteration of the critical points in our written submission. First, on the economic impact, this bill does pose a risk, in our view, to the future development of the internet economy in New Zealand. At a general level, if the balance between privacy and national security concerns is got wrong or is not clear, New Zealanders will eventually come to question whether the information they make available on the internet is secure. And if they do that, if they don't trust the local environment, they'll either be less willing to use local services or less willing to use internet services altogether. And that economic impact should be a concern to the government, because quite rightly and quite bravely, you've invested a good quantity of money in the ultra-fast broadband network. Faster broadband is seen as a key economic enabler of New Zealand, both in the public services goals that you set out for better public services and also in the broader economic environment. But if at the same time we're sending signals in the other direction that call into question the utility of what we might use that for, then that's going in the wrong direction in our view. Security legislation, in other words, needs to be aware of its economic impact, and that's about drawing the right boundaries. It isn't about saying that there's no role for legitimate interception and the role of the GCSB, which is an important one. And at a more specific level, the real or perceived lack of appropriate legal safeguards in this bill, especially in light of PRISM revelations, which has become quite a media storm, may lead to more people using the kind of anonymizing technologies that are available, things like virtual private networking, encryption, and so on. And those technologies are available for people to use. There's no problem with internet users choosing to do so. One of the consequences of that is that when they do, network managers cannot compress the traffic that is used. So, given that one of the key constraints in New Zealand's international bandwidth, the absence of extra cables over the Pacific, that's kind of a practical impact that may be had on sort of national congestion and international congestion if there is a bias towards that kind of traffic.
So this is a very technical point. Are you saying that in theory, if you didn't want to be caught by what you perceive to be NNC GCSB collecting your metadata, you have the capacity to avoid that, but you have to do that by putting encryption on your own data to prevent that happening?
I think it's less easy with metadata, but with the actual communication itself, if people encrypt them, they can use things like PGP encryption that is just between them and the end user. And the
Way around, though, is my point.
There's a way around the communication being intercepted.
So if that's right, you're the technical expert, you'll know. Doesn't that mean, therefore, that if you're really so worried about this, you encrypt your own data? Now, most people aren't going to do that because most people actually aren't that worried.
If people are particularly concerned about privacy, or if they have nefarious motives that mean that they want to hide it, they've always got those options. Or they've got the option of dropping off the net altogether and just using,
There's a way out. Anybody that doesn't like this, it's a way out, isn't it?
It is, but the consequence deviating away from the remarks of that, in turn, is that if people are in that situation, it raises the bar for all of the work that the GCSB needs to do, because it widens the ambit of scanning and interception they need to do. So it's kind of the arms race concept, it sparks the answer, that's not another If you can make a vision fly in a direction, you can, yeah. So there's all these other non-digital means.
But there are ways around it, is your point, basically.
Yeah. But the other point is that we live in a secular, stable, open, liberal country, right? Unfortunately, there's nothing that guarantees that will be the case in the future. So the regime that we're building here needs to not only deal with the status quo, it needs to deal with people with less good motives in power that may emerge in the future of our politics. Now, I hope that they don't, but if that does happen, we don't want to build a system where they can find out where you were walking with your cell phone every minute for the last 6 months. So it's an important issue there. Encryption is just one of the others, and we've got technical advisors, some of them have got security clearance, who would be available to the committee or to officials to go through some of the detail of this material. But the high level point is that if people don't feel their material is secure online, and if they reduce their use of these services as a result, there's an economic gain that is missing there. And so part of the issue here is that while you and governments and some of the telcos have had a long time to consider this whole regime, for most of the rest of us, we weren't aware that the policy debate was going on. And that's why we were very grateful to the committee to extend submissions for a week or so. But it would be ideal, and would still be ideal, to use this as an opportunity to have the broader debate about all of these issues. I'll just turn over to Susan Chalmers to go through the metadata points and some highlights of our submission.
Thank you. So I think it's important to realize that metadata should not described by the Legislation Advisory Committee as intellectually circular. There was also discussion about the difficulty of delineating public from private communications. And we also note that New Zealand courts have been grappling with this very question with the term as defined in the current Act. So this is already a question that's up in the air, and we suggest that the committee actually look at this as a valuable opportunity to be able to maintain an inclusive discussion on the definition of private communications, how it relates to metadata, what we consider, how we consider the interplay between these both, with all stakeholders. And so, given the timing of this bill, which is quite prescient in light of all of the discussion worldwide on state surveillance, we think the time is now to be able to engage with not only people in this jurisdiction, but other jurisdictions to enter into this discussion. I'd like to turn finally to reiterating some of the main points that we made in our submission. And you have that before you, so I thank you for your time and consideration in reading it. So we have made clear that we support the spirit of those provisions in the bill that address New Zealand's cybersecurity posture. Internet NZ considers cybersecurity to be extremely important. We, like the National Cybersecurity Centre, which is housed in the GCSB, are a corporate member of the New Zealand Internet Task Force, which is a community of security professionals focusing on improving the operational robustness, integrity, and security of the Internet in New Zealand. We wish to highlight our call in our submission that if the cybersecurity function remains within the GCSB, that the work of the Bureau in this area is properly separated or firewalled from its intelligence gathering functions. And these are the three functions that we see in 8A, 8B, and 8C that I'm referring to. So people need to be sure that there is no leakage of information and data across those separate functions. And the reason here is our concern is a very practical one. Once you receive data, it's hard to unring a bell. And in order to be able to use this information and data in accordance with the intent of functions A, B, and C, we suggest that there be auditable walls between those functions, just to make sure to maintain the integrity of the different functions in relation to the data that is gathered under those functions. The balance of our submission focused on the impact that the bill will have on the fundamental right of privacy of Internet users in New Zealand and outside of New Zealand for that matter. Internet NZ maintains that as a matter of principle, human rights should apply online. To this extent, the bill is missing adequate legal safeguards for the protection of individuals' privacy. We have made several recommendations to the committee to address this concern, including a suggestion that a member of the judiciary be involved in the warrant issuance process. Checks and balances must be in place ex ante and ex post, before and after a private person's communications are intercepted, and ex post to review to make sure that the system is operating according to the law. The bill, unfortunately, provides adequately for neither. So one final point is that we stand behind statements made in this respect by the Law Society yesterday, and especially the point that if we do not know the specificity, the activities that the GCSB is engaged in, we really have no understanding of how to craft appropriate legal safeguards in response to that activity. Thank you.
10 being dramatic and 1 being not at all. Over the last decade, what has been New Zealand companies' usage of the internet as a way to store information about what they do, promote themselves, all that sort of stuff?
It's been increasing. So,
What do you reckon?
do you mean the increase or the
On a scale of 1 to 10, you go back 10 years ago, let's take a big company like Fonterra. How much would they had from a dedicated, legitimate source, that would be risky for your business.
Yeah.
So if you were a major New Zealand company, I think GCSB has a role in providing support to those companies about making sure they understand the risks that they're at and potentially providing them some technology support to upgrade their capability to have a defensive strategy against those type of threats.
I think that there certainly needs to be a function that does that, whether it's the GCSB or whether it's the focus of the National Cybersecurity Centre. And I think I understand the logic of putting it in the GCSB in the sense that a lot of this threat is around signals and communication stuff. Wherever that is, it's really important that the government is on the side of big companies like that to help protect them. The question in this legislation, I think, is about the monitoring and authorization of that process and making sure that information that comes from that doesn't accidentally spill in an inappropriate way into the intelligence gathering.
In the world, do you think there are websites that promote the making of bombs and undertaking terrorist activities?
I'm sure there must be websites like that.
What do you think it says about a person in New Zealand that accesses those sites?
What it says about it.
Yeah.
Well, it might say anything about them. There might be a 14-year-old who's just looking it up because they're bored after school. It might be someone who intends to use the technology.
Yeah, so if your next door neighbour started accessing sites that explicitly laid out how to make a bomb, how to detonate that bomb, how to be the most effective at killing people, how would you feel about that?
I think that if the issue is should there be an intelligence function, then the answer is that there should. And that's what the SIS as well is, to tackle cases like that.
I was very interested in your argument which says basically a broad reading of the effect of the bill as currently drafted would be that it provides access to anyone's communication, whether live or stored, including communication. So a broad reading of this bill as it's currently drafted. And then you kind of go on to say, the issue that this creates is that essentially that the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security will then be in a position where they have no choice but to approve actions which may be extreme incursions on human rights and privacy because in fact they're lawful. And so we're setting up this thing where we say we've got the Inspector General and we're beefing it up, right, part of the bill to provide more oversight, but because we're changing the law to enable complete surveillance, effectively the Inspector General, if they just enforce the law, have to sign off mass surveillance. That seems to me a point that other submitters haven't raised. Have I paraphrased that right from your submission?
I think that the paraphrase is accurate, and that's why the representations we make in the submission is that the law needs to be very carefully drawn so that the intelligence operations are directed and that there isn't excessive use of this metadata information.
And the second point I was very interested in was, which kind of goes to the previous discussion, which was essentially you're arguing for either a standalone cybersecurity agency or one that sits within the GCSB that kind of has a wall between it and the GCSB. And that is that we don't confuse the intelligence function of the GCSB with the cybersecurity function, because you see the cybersecurity function as critical to the New Zealand internet. But you're kind of saying, why should that be mixed up with the intelligence function? Those two things are separate functions.
Well, the bill does clearly delineate between them as functions, and it does have some different provisions for the way that intelligence accrued in the use of each of them is allowed. And that is conceptually a framework that makes sense. But the difficulty, as my colleague said, is once the information is in there, what information systems does the GCSB? Does it have 3 separate systems? Does it have 1? What are the links between them? That's why the Inspector General, they can't just audit the systems, though that is an important role. They need to audit the reality of the transactions in those systems as well. So all of this is about saying national security is an important priority, intelligence gathering is an important priority. We think there is a logic to saying that you could put the cybersecurity function elsewhere. And part of the difficulty that we've got as an organisation across many issues, not all of them in huge depth, is that the policy rationale underlying the location there hasn't really been discussed prior to the legislation. So maybe we could have made a more meaningful statement on that if that was the case. It's the government's prerogative not to do it that way. It just makes me that our input is maybe less targeted than it could be.
Can I ask a comparative question? The legislation we're setting up here and how it compares, say, for example,
we haven't done a comparative analysis of this legislation. We're not going to make a comment on that question.
In terms of, you talked about the time you needed to submit, etc. Do you think we've missed an opportunity here in terms of being able to have a much broader discussion in New Zealand, given the sort of incidents and events? What a discussion that might have been, one, given New Zealand more confidence in our intelligence agencies, but two, derived it, come at a place which would be, give us a better bill, or a better set of legislation that would span not just GCSB but other things.
I think there are, you could take a political lens on that and say that more time is always helpful for a policy debate. You could say that more information provided might have made for a more informed policy debate, but the corollary is these are national security issues. People don't want a lot of information. They don't want to put out the information that might indicate the specific targeting that's going on. So I think the debate now is underway. I think there are a few cameras in the room and journalists. And that is good. And what is hopefully the case is that people are scratching below the surface of the debate, challenging the claims on both sides. We're pretty confident of our analysis of legal questions here. The policy questions are the hardest to debate because there's least information about them.
Section 8C, is it your view that the other agencies should be able to access the expertise of the GCSB with respect to their statutory responsibility?
I don't think we've taken a position on that in our submission, but the point that we have made in our submission is that any changes to that list should be subject to a higher threshold of change than is currently provided for.
You made the point earlier that you were happy for Institute New Zealand, which is very kind offer, to give technical expertise to the committee if we wanted it. I mean, does it follow though that actually a lot of the stuff is very technical in nature, and actually, it's not actually a capability that just can be replicated, located everywhere, certainly not without at least a cost of doing that.
Yeah, there may be an argument that says that this is expensive, difficult capabilities to use without, and that's why we want one agency to do it. But that argument hasn't been particularly apparent in the regulatory impact statements or in the bills themselves, which is not surprising because that wouldn't be in that. It would be in the cabinet papers, it would be in internal documents. So, I assume that was part of the logic here. And that, if you do choose that logic, which makes sense in fiscally constrained times, the responsibility then is to make sure the legal framework is as sharp and as hard-edged as possible so as to mitigate the concerns that we've raised.
Historical view that they provide agency support in this other area of technical expertise and they act under the warranted authority that the other agencies have rather than replicate, which is not unusual in a place like New Zealand because actually fundamentally we're small and we often do outsource things to other agencies.
Prime Minister, maybe you could elucidate on your comments there with respect to the use of that information collected by the GSB when they're acting on behalf of another agency.
The comments in the submission, I haven't got the document.
Well, you've essentially said here that you think, whereas accepting that they are collecting information on behalf of others, that there should be restrictions on what use GCSB could make of that information if it was acting in its own purpose.
Yes, because if it's operating under the intelligence purpose, that's got different requirements around how the intelligence is permitted. So what we wouldn't want to see is any kind of lower standard or lower threshold for approval for interception or information being obtained under the 8C power than leaking into the 8B function.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we're going to take Dr. Kate Hughes and Rob Green. Okay, we have a copy of your book, so thank you very much indeed. You probably know the drill. You have 15 minutes, so please feel free to use the time however
go too precise, but we'll catch up with the slack soon.
Okay, but thank you anyway. Because of the harassment that we've both experienced here and in the UK over many years, we request that the names of the witnesses on the statements which we have provided the committee be withheld to protect them. We also ask you to respect the names on the documents we've handed out to you just at this moment. As a member of the first Public Advisory Committee on Disarmament and Arms Control, which was charged with looking after the Nuclear Free Act, I argued in 1988 for a parliamentary commissioner to oversee the GCSB. I therefore support the sections in the bill which call for greater oversight of and accountability by the GCSB by a committee made up of independent New Zealanders, including women and Māori, and I would ask also for consideration by this committee to look at the possibility of putting someone who's experienced surveillance, such as myself and others, to be there in a similar role to what Louise Nicholas has been doing with the police in terms of reviewing the culture. However, as I know from reading some of my SIS files, I have been under surveillance by the SIS since at least the mid-1980s because of my role as a peace and anti-nuclear campaigner since 1975. And when I asked for my SIS files in 2008, I was told that no files existed until my name was found on someone else's file, and so negative intelligence proved that there had been a file on me. I am a law-abiding New Zealander who served on 2 different UN Secretary General advisory boards on disarmament matters and represented various New Zealand peace groups at international meetings. For nearly 30 years, I have collected proof that I and my family have been subject to interference with my communications by phone, mail and emails within New Zealand and internationally. We have supplied you with some of the witness statements about intruders into our Christchurch homes and offices, which have happened at least 5 times since Rob, my husband Rob, archives of anti-nuclear and his Aunt Hilda Mulwell's murder papers arrived in 1999. Those break-ins happened when we were overseas and my children, my daughters, were in our home. We have had reports from neighbours during the last 10 years of people sitting outside our homes reading in cars for up to 2 hours to the point where they thought they were being spied on. We don't know if it is the GCSB that has been illegally monitoring our family and sharing information with foreign powers, or whether it is another foreign power gathering their own information, either with permission from this government or not, but it continues to this day. I want to give proof of this. In June 1992, I received evidence that phone conversations between me and Rob in the United Kingdom were monitored and our mail intercepted. In May, I had phoned him to ask him to send me evidence about safety concerns with UK nuclear-powered submarines, as our government intended to amend our anti-nuclear policy at that time and allow visits by US and UK nuclear-powered submarines and warships. Rob asked for transcripts from Polaris and Deepwater documentaries from the Thames TV. It arrived, sealed, but inside 8 pages had been ripped out. And those 8 pages, they actually contained the information that the chairman of the Nuclear Warship Safety Committee, when he was asked why the committee had banned UK nuclear submarines from visiting foreign ports until cracked standard cooling pipes on the reactor had been repaired, he replied that we would not like any size of accident to happen at all, particularly in a foreign port. This was damning information which someone didn't want me to present to the government inquiry. Someone in the UK was therefore given the task of intercepting and tampering with Rob's mail. He sent me a video of the documentary which I copied and sent to former Prime Minister David Lange. A few months later, Lange reported to me that it disappeared off his desk. I had been in communication with his secretary about the issue. In 1993, when mail from Foreign Minister Don McKinnon, the International Association of Lawyers Against Nuclear Arms from The Hague, and another letter from Rob, there's one from McKinnon, examples, and I'd like you to even be able to have a look at these if you want to, because I'm not making them up. For example, the first letter I ever wrote to Rob in Britain, when we weren't even really talking to each other, was ripped open at that end, and the first few that came to me, even before I got a P.O. box, were ripped like this and like this. It's been going on for 30 years, and I have to say, I'm actually quite sick of it. But I've had them open at our letterbox, at our P.O. box, and in the UK. Letters have come from Ireland, Geneva, New York, Germany, and Sweden. My UN documents from the meetings with the UN Secretary General, my board meetings. The papers have arrived when I posted them even from England in this condition. This is addressed to myself, from myself. It had my UN Secretary General board papers in it. It is completely empty. I have not touched the envelope. It says item damaged before arrival in the UK. The second one that I posted back from England 3 weeks later arrived even more disturbingly. Cut open at the top with this part just sealed over. I hadn't done that. And another envelope to a man in Wellington stuffed inside. I don't know who has the power to do that, but I can tell you, committee members, that my UN Secretary General Board papers are extremely boring, and I know that I wasn't being watched for that particular thing. I'm going to take the extra minute, even if Rob doesn't like me to, because I've got proof in the envelope that you have been given, the latest letters, that there is correspondence on email from a university person on page 5. I don't want to say his name in front of other people, but he rang me one day after we had spoken to young leaders at Canterbury University where I used to lecture, and we had been filmed, and they had talked to us about what it was that the students said, why are you being intimidated? And we've been recorded. So he emailed me to say, I'm going to send you, or in fact I'm going to drop you the USB stick that has got film on it. So he sends it, me emails, and you can read them all, 2 pages of them. And at the end of it, he couldn't get to see me, he said 6, he said, oh, send it to your P.O. box page. He sends it to my P.O. box in Riccarton from the University of Canterbury. It arrived with a slip here and no USB stick in it. I opened it at the top. So somebody is watching my email and our phone to know exactly when something like this is coming in, which only copies the film. We also have had correspondence from very interesting ones. A very good example. I received an envelope from the IRD to me at our P.O. box. It arrived with an envelope in it. It's exactly the same address on the front of it, P.O. box. And the envelope is cut open like that. It's come from a person in Auckland with a $20 donation for our work. And the note says from IRD, enclosed items, enclosed received from IRD in error. I could go on forever, but the last one I'm going to leave you with, believe it or not, is one that I sent just a few weeks ago from England. And because we were being harassed there and building up political support actually for the case against the murder of Rob Zahn, I asked a member of Parliament in Britain
for having the courage to hold these public hearings before this committee on this bill. I am confident that this will be unimaginable in Britain. As indicated in our submission, I held a key post in naval intelligence during the 1982 Falklands War, after which I left the British Navy under redundancy. Following the murder 2 years later of my aunt and mentor, Hilda Murrell, an anti-nuclear energy and weapons campaigner, in 1991 I became one of very few ex-British Navy commanders with nuclear weapon experience to speak out against them. I then met Kate and chaired the British affiliate of the World Court Project, which was a New Zealand citizen-initiated legal challenge to nuclear deterrence at the International Court of Justice before our marriage in Christchurch and my immigration there a few years later. When the police in the UK began a cold case review in 2002 of my aunt's case, I challenged them to come to Christchurch and hear what I, as my aunt's next of kin, had discovered about her murder. Two senior detectives did so, and it was around then that an ex-New Zealand Army neighbour noticed a suspicious British couple renting a townhouse next to his, about 200 metres from ours. They were there for some 2 years, which covered the cold case review and the run-up to the 2005 trial of Andrew George, a man we have reason to believe was set up for my aunt's murder, but was a key witness. About 2 years ago, our neighbour saw the same suspicious British man again in our local ward. When I asked the detective leading the cold case review if he could arrange for our home to be swept for bugs, this is what he said. If they're state of the art, they won't find them. And if they're not, you want another break-in? Interference with our mail, phones and email intensified after Andrew George's conviction and failed appeal as we began writing this book. We suspect this is because we have gained access to evidence known to both prosecution and defence, not presented to the jury, which probably would acquit Andrew George. In jail for 15 years. Furthermore, this information indicated collusion between police, forensic science service and the state security authorities to cover up what amounted to a state crime. To protect sources, we have had to take extensive precautions, including never allowing our house to be unoccupied, never discussing sensitive information or plans in our home, or sending emails about them, dismantling cell phones before meetings, arranging safe remote storage for documents and safe addresses for mail. Phone calls to and from UK, including British MPs, have often been cut off. Recently, an email to 2 MPs, one of them Austin Mitchell, our British political champion, was blocked, and we even received notification, connection refused. You can see evidence of this on page 5 of a set of documents. Since publishing the New Zealand edition of our book in October 2011, we have received new information, leading to the possibility that my aunt was suspected of obtaining copies of extremely sensitive information which could seriously embarrass the current British government. Someone in Britain could have copies and might try to send them to me. This would explain the extraordinary ongoing interference with our communications, in which we fear GCSB could be involved. To give a recent example, last week, when I tried phoning the UK publisher of an updated edition of my book, and I've got the cover here, appearing in 3 weeks, and the last sheet of your document, the number would not connect when I tried 3 times. I succeeded only after using another phone number and getting them to phone us. This made us suspect GCSB interference. We have done what we could to report our concerns to the appropriate authorities and have met the Director of the SIS, Dr. Warren Tucker, the National Security Officer for New Zealand Post, a Privacy Commissioner, Telecom New Zealand and the Christchurch Police. Even when a monitor was placed on our PO box, one morning I found it open, but locked, with the mail sitting inside. The only one. That felt very threatening. It seems they are powerless to prevent such criminal activity. And I now like to refer to the top 2 sheets in your set of documents. He's running out of time.
Running out of time.
Anyway,
very much.
If you'd like to, please read those documents about the change of policy of GCSB when they neither confirm or deny now whether they have any information on it. And I'd just like to end by saying I would like to give this committee a challenge try to increase the oversight and accountability, require the GCSB not to collaborate with any foreign power, attempting surveillance, let alone harassment of law-abiding New Zealand citizens in New Zealand. Instead, GCSB should be required to report any evidence of such criminal activity by a foreign power. Thank you, gentlemen, for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you very much.
Okay, Mr. Dotcom and Mr. Vencolt, please. Okay, so welcome. You have 15 minutes. You're free to use the time however you like. Obviously, you can split the time between giving your submission and then us asking you questions, or of course you're free to just talk at us, or we can just ask you questions straight away. So your time starts now. Welcome.
Yes, it is an understanding because the committee sent us an email and told us that we will have 25 minutes, and we prepared ourselves for 25 minutes. So my statement will be about 15 minutes.
Well, you're free to use your 15 minutes. I think we've been quite clear with you. It's consistent with every other member that's submitted. So you have 15 minutes. Please feel free to stop.
Well, it's unclear because we were emailed that we have 25 minutes, and I was told that you changed that today. And I just think it's not fair.
That's actually not right. Recently just sent us an email to say you wanted more time. So you'd be quite aware of that. So you have 15 minutes. Please start and feel free to use the time. Okay.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak about the proposed amendment to the GCSB bill. I had the misfortune of experiencing what happens when surveillance powers are abused. An unlawful destruction of property, reputation, and freedom. It is an injustice that I continue to fight every day. These abuses should never happen again, and that's why I'm here today to speak out against the proposed spy law. I was illegally spied on by the GCSB, and when these violations of law were exposed, all New Zealanders, including myself, received a formal apology from the Prime Minister, John Key. But should that apology be considered a real apology when the Prime Minister is now proposing new legislation to legalize the illegality? The new GCSB bill demands an extension of spying powers. This is poorly timed considering the scandalous leaks concerning US mass surveillance of the world's population, including US allies. Unnecessary and unwarranted spying on citizens not only poses a threat to our basic liberties, it also damages diplomatic and trade relations, which does not enhance our security. Earlier this week, the European Union issued a strong statement demanding full clarification from the United States after it was discovered that the NSA had bugged European Union offices in Brussels, while member state Germany has summoned the US ambassador to warn Washington over what they describe as a breach of trust. The French president has indicated that a trade pact with the US, which was scheduled to be negotiated on July 8, may be threatened by this development. This is not a model that New Zealand should be attempting to imitate. Unchecked spying powers not only erode the right to privacy and freedom of expression, it also has a negative impact on innovation, economic growth, and business. Executives of Vodafone and Telecom have appeared before the committee to clearly state that they did not see any need to expand the GCSB's powers. They said that a new interception law would result in a chilling effect on investment and development of new networks in New Zealand. I speak to you as someone the US Department of Justice has labeled a pirate. In light of the massive and unlawful theft of personal information by the US, these charges have become deeply ironic. The proposed GCSB bill is actually supporting this piracy of private information. Most importantly, the Prime Minister has failed to explain why exactly these greater powers and greater privacy intrusions are needed. We need to tune our surveillance laws to protect TV values in light of the risks New Zealand faces. We should avoid blindly following the US into the dark ages of spying abuse. The Prime Minister wants to make us believe that the GCSB misunderstood the law. But in reality, the old GCSB Act is an example of language and legislation where there is no room for doubt or misunderstanding. The problem with the new proposed bill is the unclear language, especially concerning the power granted to determine the issuing of warrants. The Kittredge report found that the GCSB had spied on 88 New Zealanders. Despite the clear prohibition of intercepting communications from citizens and permanent residents. Clearly, there is an accountability problem here. Why would citizens choose to relax the limits on the government's spying powers in response to the GCSB breaking the law? In the 1980s, New Zealand stood up to the United States by banning nuclear warships from its harbors. In 1985, Prime Minister David Lange took the world stage and told the Americans and every other nation that nuclear weapons are morally indefensible. It was this brave stand that has given New Zealand true independence and the moral high ground. But at a great cost. The US government retaliated by virtually freezing New Zealand-US economic relations. The cost from lost opportunity to do business and trade deals with the US would amount to billions of dollars over the last 3 decades. I asked New Zealanders to consider whether that heroic stand should not be repeated today. When a great power such as the United States is committing immoral and illegal practices ranging from Guantanamo to torture to drone strikes, let alone mass surveillance against the entire world population. Including its allies. There has never been a greater need for New Zealanders to once again step forward and declare that their values shall not be abandoned or suspended under pressure from the United States. Because in reality, the GCSB is the subsidiary of the NSA and the US government calls the shots. Given the pattern of abuses of power by the GCSB, what New Zealand should establish is a fully independent oversight committee to ensure the law is observed. A regular review of GCSB compliance by a transparent third party is crucial. We need to know more before we allow any new spy legislation to pass. I suspect the real scope of illegal spying by the GCSB is much greater than we know today. Rebecca Kittredge wasn't allowed to look behind every closed door. Every member of parliament should demand a real investigation, a real independent inquiry into illegal spying, because New Zealanders need to know the truth. Please do not vote for the proposed GCSB bill until that has been done. Privacy needs heroes, just like the anti-nuclear movement needed heroes. We must constantly be reminded of why we put limits on the reach of our government. We must constantly cherish the liberties that make our society free. The respect for privacy is a moral absolute. We cannot value human rights if we hand our private information to a spy cloud with 5 eyes. the majority of whom have no legal obligation to respect your rights. The NSA can spy on New Zealanders can spy on Americans, the British on the Canadians, and so forth. And then they give each other access to retrieve data about their own citizens. They are hacking the law. Just like any partner in the Five Eyes Spy Club, the GCSB gets access to the Five Eyes Spy Cloud. This spy cloud contains every email, phone call, chat message, SMS message, almost all communication of every New Zealander. The GCSB can simply input the selected data of a person, like they did in my case, as if they do a Google search, and everything about that person becomes visible, going back many years into the past. All they need to get to all that information is your phone number, your email address, or your IP address. A former NSA official interviewed by Wired in 2012, long before the Snowden leaks, described the US-based Utah data center, a data center which has the size of 17 football fields, and said this is where the Five Eyes information is stored as a turnkey totalitarian state. Can you imagine the power that comes with a system like that? Theoretically, you can know everything about your opponent's instantly. How much money someone has in the New York bank account, who leaked secret government reports to the media, or who called one of their donors to thank them for a political donation that later declared an enemy. This is the kind of power that makes you want to hire a trusted high school friend to run the whole thing. So it's you and he and one trusted analyst who prepares everything you need to know, and nobody will ever know. The temptation to abuse of such powers is very real. My experience alone shows that the abuse of spying powers is not limited to national security considerations, but may also be manipulated by special interests. GCSB was involved on the raid on my home to support an alleged breach of copyright for Hollywood. This has nothing to do with terrorism or national security. It is quite wrong of anyone to suggest that this bill simply clarifies existing law. You don't clarify by giving the Prime Minister new power to issue warrants to spy on New Zealanders just because he believes something might be in the public interest. You don't clarify by allowing the GCSB to spy on New Zealanders and others just because some in the GCSB think that the target might damage the New Zealand economy. And you certainly don't clarify by allowing the GCSB to obtain any information it wants about New Zealanders from the NSA or other Five Eyes partners without a warrant, and in return share with them any information the GCSB has about anyone, New Zealanders included. The proposed GCSB bill is not a clarification. It's a huge overreach by an agency that has shown it cannot operate legally within the far more limited powers it has right now. And I'm almost done. The proposed GCSB bill is an insult to the strong concerns recently expressed by the United Nations about governments using vague concepts of national security to justify massive reductions in privacy and other human rights. The proposed GCSB bill is a betrayal of New Zealand's Bill of Rights, as the New Zealand Law Society has quite rightly pointed out. It is not a clarification. This new GCSB bill is totally unjustified in a free and democratic society. It will be in our best interest, in the interest of every New Zealander who still believes in privacy, freedom of expression, and government transparency, to make our voices heard loud and clear. The proposed GCSB bill is morally indefensible. Thank you.
Just run through a few things. Firstly, just to clarify something for you so you understand the law. In relation to your own situation, yes, you're quite right, this is illegal, but it would also be illegal under the current law as well, so nothing actually changes. It would be illegal activity that's not being resolved by the law. Secondly, in terms of Rebecca Kinneridge, actually you're quite wrong, she has full access to information. What do though is, I'm sure you're aware, or maybe when you test you're aware, is provide agency support to the SIS, so that's a sort of outsourcing, right? We accept that?
Well, first of all, the Kittredge report and Rebecca Kittredge were not allowed to look into the Geeks.com matter, right? So not all the doors were open.
Take a look at all information, but let me just ask you this question. When you had Mega Upload, that was file storage, right? That file sharing system that people could put data on, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And could an individual or a company that used Mega Upload, could they have potentially put that data on their own system and shared it their own way, but they outsourced it to you guys because it was an efficient way of doing it, right?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, okay. So
they
let's
put
start
it on
on this
their own
question.
servers, but it's much more costly.
Yeah,
You have to buy the server, you have to pay for the bandwidth.
So in the private sector, if I as an individual find it a lot cheaper and more efficient to outsource that part of my business to a specialist like Mega Upload, wouldn't you say you want to outsource their specialisation of gathering information through GCSB, where they're under a legal warranty basis to do so? Isn't it logical that companies all the time actually outsource their...
Well, I mean, the GCSB spy cloud is nothing else as, a big Mega Upload, but the problem that I have with that spy cloud is that it shares access with other countries, and if the Americans spy on New Zealanders and put that in the spy cloud, all the GCSB has to do is look for a New Zealander by putting their number in, and they know everything about that person. And that can't be right.
My point with .com was a very simple one, isn't it? But actually in the private sector, people go to outsource their activities as they do with Mega Upload. And actually, that's because you have specialisation. If GCSB has specialisation under legal warrant and legal authority, it must make absolute sense for the government to do exactly the same thing and allow under those activities that to be outsourced. It's exactly the same
Well,
as Mega
cost
Upload.
saving are great, but on Mega Upload you would share a file. On the GCSB spy cloud you share private information about citizens that you don't have any right to access. That is the big difference.
Let's take a couple of questions. We've got to catch a bit more time.
Can I just acknowledge the fact that if what had happened to you hadn't happened, we wouldn't be here today. And so in some ways we're grateful for this coming out. I don't believe the process has been in any way adequate, but at least the fact that what happened to you has happened. We are here looking at GCSB. Could I ask you, in your opinion, do you feel there has been or was adequate oversight of the GCSB by the Minister and the Director in terms of the activities that happened?
Well, I think the answer to that is simple. If there was proper oversight, these things wouldn't happen. So the answer is no.
Do you feel that or do you know or believe that the Prime Minister was aware of what you were doing prior to what he has actually stated at the time?
Sorry if you wasn't aware.
Before the raid took place.
Well, he knew about me before the raid. I know about that. I know.
I know you don't know. I know you don't know, actually, but that's fine.
Why are you turning red?
I'm not. Why are you sweating?
That's hot.
Oh, okay. Sure. Well, go and check what you filed. Okay, sure. One more question and we're out of here.
Thanks very much for coming along. And like Mr. Shiro, I'd like to acknowledge that we wouldn't be here were it not for you. And I'd also like to acknowledge that no one else had the resources to crack open the GCSB to find out what they were doing illegally. And it was only because we were simply found out that they were operating illegally. Some people say if you have nothing to fear, you have nothing to hide. The Prime Minister says this, others say this. And therefore we should have nothing to fear from this bill which enables a mass surveillance state. Gives the right to spy on all citizens. What's your response to those who say if you have nothing to fear, you have nothing to hide?
Well, I mean, that's clearly wrong. Everyone has the right to privacy for reasons. There are things that you don't want to share, and things like in our case can be taken out of context. Bram wrote one email joking that we are modern day pirates. And we made that joke because the same evening he watched a documentary about the pirates of the Silicon Valley, about Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, and compared us to that. But the FBI took just that part of the email and put that into an indictment. So it means, you can write something completely
previously we've given him an extra 7 minutes, so we didn't think like the agenda, but we'll put the lead. All those opposed? 3 of us opposed. Thank you very much, Mr. Doctor.
Sorry, I think
Most appreciated.
Mr. Bank, do you oppose to us having another 10 minutes, Mr. Doctor?
I'm not here to be interrogated by you.
Thanks very much, guys. See you later. It's been fun. Jared Burns, please. Mr. Burns, you have 10 minutes. So, as you know, you can use the time however you like. Please feel free.
Ngā rangatira mā, I tēnei wiki o te reo Māori, tēnā koutou, e te Premier, tēnā koe. Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, for this chance to make an oral submission. You will all have my written submission. As you will see there, one of the reasons I made a submission was my experience in Latin America in the early
So apparently that's the end of that.